Good afternoon, and welcome everybody to this session on continuous self-improvement after self-study. My name is Kushnud Haq, and I'm one of the vice presidents with Middle States. And along with me is Dr. Edna Corbett, who is the lead vice president with Middle States. We also have 3 institutional representatives who will share their stories about the self-study process, as well as what transpired on their campuses after the self-study was over. Starting with Dr. Raylan Cooter, Vice Provost for Academic Infrastructure and Effectiveness at Thomas Jefferson University. Mrs. Kelly Sisler, Director of Analytics, Institutional Research at Garrett College. And finally, Dr. Jose Garcia Leon, Dean of Academic Affairs and Assessment at the Juilliard School. Next slide, please. Actually, can you go back to this disclaimer? So we have to do this with every presentation. I want to make sure I didn't miss this. The main point here is that this presentation is property of Middle States, and you need permission from the president at Middle States, msche.org, in order to use this video or this presentation. And also, this is not a professional advice from Middle States, a replacement for professional advice from Middle States, nor does it guarantee any specific accreditation outcomes. Next slide. So let's talk about some of the learning outcomes. And again, this is after the self-study takes place and the institution gets reaffirmation. What are the next steps? So in this webinar, we'll talk about understanding the purpose and role of the self-study in the context of institutional planning and assessment processes. So as you know, the self-study process itself is all about assessment, assessing your academic areas, assessing your non-academic areas, and really understanding the successes as well as the gaps that may exist, and then connecting that to the planning for next session or for next time period. And then recognize how institutions use the opportunities for improvement and innovation resulting from the self-study process to guide their improvement efforts. And then identify how ongoing attention to accreditation compliance helps institutions prepare for subsequent self-study evaluation activities. So this is not a one and done thing, but this is an ongoing process that prepares you for the next self-study. Understand common strategies used by institutions to document ongoing institutional compliance with commission standards. And finally, articulate norms and practices associated with effective practice in evidencing compliance and use of assessment results. So keeping these learning outcomes in mind, we'll go to the next slide. And for next few slides, both Edna and I will provide you with the context of this presentation, and that will follow our our co-facilitator sharing their stories and their insight and giving advice on how to move forward in the post self-study process.
Kushnud, excuse my interrupting. Could you tell everybody that the chat in the chat we have the link to the presentation?
Oh yes, so you already did. We have the link to the presentation in the chat in the PDF format in case you're interested. So let's talk a little bit about the role of self-study in institutions' planning and assessment processes. As I mentioned before, the self-study is all about assessment. and more middle states looking at not only whether institutions are doing assessment, but also what they are doing with the assessment results and the rich data that they get from a 2.5-year-long process and how they're tied to the planning for the future. So that's the main theme of our presentation. So the self-study process can play an important role in planning for ongoing improvements in all aspects. Self-study can provide important data to inform new and existing strategic planning processes. And these recommendations and advice comes in a couple of different ways. The first one is when institution self-identifies opportunities for improvement and innovation after the steering committee and the working groups examine various aspects of academic and non-academic areas and identify challenges, gaps, and deficiencies during the self-study process. So these are self-identified recommendations. And then the second type comes from the team itself, the visiting team. Their recommendations, collegial advice, after they've had the opportunity to look at your self-study document and conducted visits and interviews on campus. Next slide, please. So those are the two types I talked about, but there's also something known as affirmation with follow-up. This is when some institutions may require follow-up reporting to ensure continued compliance with the middle states standards and requirements. So this is affirmation. However, commission may be concerned about continuity, about improvements, and about sustainability. And it may ask for a follow-up either through annual institutional update, which is filed by every institution on an annual basis. And as part of that, the commission may ask what steps were taken to improve and sustain accreditation efforts. And second area or second method is the supplemental information report, which is usually due 1 year after the self-study and the reaffirmation process is over. And it's the same idea where the commission is looking and making sure that institution shows progress, institutions shows sustainability and improvements, and reports back to the commission. Next slide. So I'll hand this over now to Dr. Ina Corbett, who will talk about some of the most common institutional opportunities for improvements.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome again to this webinar. Now we're going to move on to identify the themes having to do with institutional self-recommendations as well as the team recommendations. So in your next self-study, the commission expects that you will address in some way the recommendations that you made to yourself, but also the recommendations that were issued by the team. Even if there is no follow-up, generally the teams will have recommendations issued to you, and they will use the standardized recommendations that we ask all the team members to use, all the teams. Now, as a reminder, you do not need to show that you have implemented the suggestions or collegial advice. As you know, collegial advice is optional for you to decide, yeah, this applies to us or this doesn't apply to us. But the recommendations are something that you need to pay attention to. And therefore, you should see how, you should determine how you're going to follow up on those recommendations. So these are the most common themes that we have used. The vice president liaisons for all of our institutions, we get together and we talk about and try to see what are the trends that we're seeing with our institutions. And so what we have seen from having reviewed hundreds of self-study reports over the last couple of years, we have identified these common themes. For standard 1, institutions often identify as a point of improvement the review and refreshment of the institutional mission and goals. However, in general, for standard 1, the teams normally talk about the strategic plan and ensuring that the strategic plan is followed and that it is developed with the mission in mind. Another common theme, and this is mostly from the institutions themselves, is the improvement of diversity, equity, and inclusion. This is very common, and it is often associated with standards 2, 3, and 4. We have seen that this is probably the most common one over the last few years. Another one that is very, very, that we often see is the improvement of student success indicators, whether they are retention, graduation rates, job placement rates, exam pass rates. And we have seen also in connection with the previous one that institutions are talking more and more about improving student success indicators for specific populations in order to address their DEI goals. For standard 4, it is very common to for the institutions to talk about improve overall student experience. And for here, we're not talking only about the student support services, but the overall experience. In fact, many times when an institution identifies a priority or uses priorities-based type of self-study process, they're talking about improving the overall student experience, whether it's in the classroom or outside the classroom. Another one that we have seen is that institutions recommend to themselves that they engage in strategic planning process. When the institutions come to Self-Study Institute, we talk about how are you going to connect the self-study process to strategic planning. And so it is different when, depending on where you are in your strategic planning process. So if you are prior to, if you're at the end of your strategic plan when you do your self-study, you would be looking at that strategic plan differently than if you're just beginning the process or in the middle of the process. Often these are connected from standard 1 because it's mission and goal, standard 1, but also the implementation of strategic planning, which would be standard 6. Another one that we have seen is that institutions recommend to themselves that they review and refresh the curriculum. And this does not only mean creation of new programs, but actually revision of the programs currently offered by the institution in order to make sure that they are meeting the needs of the students, but also meeting the needs of the job market. One that we have seen, and actually more often from teams, but also from the institutions, is the intent to improve governance processes. And that has to do with standards 1, 2, but particularly with standard 7, which is leadership, governance, and administration. So institutions are often talking about, are they going to have more transparent governance processes, or are they going to work with their board in order to assist the board in assessing their role and also improving the connection of the board with the institution itself. The second most common that we have seen, both from institutions and from teams, is the improved resource allocation and budgetary processes for standard 6. From the teams, we often see that also the improvement of resources in general. So increasing resources or connection of enrollment to budgetary processes and something like that. But it is very common that on both sides, both institutions and teams talk about the resource allocation, the budgetary processes, and the connection to this next most popular, most common recommendation, which is improve assessment processes. And as you see on the screen, is not only from one standard or another, is not only for standard 5, not only for standard 6, It is particular for standard 5, but it is very common to see improvement of assessment processes for all standards, particularly because, as you know, the last criterion of every single standard is about the periodic assessment of whatever processes, whatever is involved in that particular standard. So what are some of the proposed strategies for implementing recommendations? What should you do once the self-study is done, the team has been here, whether it was on site, they were here, they did the oral exit report, you're done, you said, hi, see you in 8 years, or however long it is. Or you were virtual, as you have been over the last 2 years, and the team give their report and they clicked off, done. What do you do? After you relax for a little bit, maybe take a nap because you haven't slept well for the last 2 years. What should the self-study leadership team do? One, first of all, evaluate, assess, and analyze each standard and related recommendations. As you know, that we are using standardized recommendations. We ask the teams to use standardized recommendations. Sometimes, and we will admit it, those recommendations are not exactly as specific as you would like them to be. And that is why we ask the teams that in the findings section of their report, that they absolutely describe and specify exactly what you want the institution to follow through on. So you would not only be looking at the recommendation itself, but you will be looking at the whole section called the findings. And that's why you really need to pay very close attention to every single item. Even if what they're saying is something really good, you want to then continue to do that particularly really good thing. Then prioritize. Prioritize recommendations. Which ones are the most relevant? Which ones are the ones that you can do now? Which ones require a much longer term? Which ones you should be doing right now? So this is a matter of judgment by the leaders of the institution. Not only what can we do right now, but what can we do, what should we be doing that would have the greatest impact on our institution? Because the whole point of self-study is not only assessing, while it is assessing compliance, but it is about self-improvement. It is about the process of continuous improvement. And therefore, you should see how can we implement some of these ideas, because the value of the peer review is that you have external eyes, people who are similar, coming from similar institutions to yours, that provide very good recommendations to you. Next, to ensure sustainability, make sure you communicate and discuss the nature of the recommendations for continuous improvement to everyone who should be involved with that. So you want to make sure, just like you made the self-study process very transparent, just like you made the self-study report available to different constituents on campus, so everybody could see what it was that you were writing about yourselves and also what you were recommending to yourselves. It should be important that you also share the team report. The team report is a valuable, very valuable document that should not be just put in a drawer or filed in a digital folder, but actually something that you should be looking at and you should be referring to on a regular basis, because 8 years sounds like a long time. It will come around much sooner than you think. Mm. So what are some other proposed strategies for implementing recommendations? Well, you should also, if you don't already have one, with support of institutional leadership, it would be a good idea to create an institutional level committee or a task force or some group that is responsible for overseeing the implementation process. And please, at this point, those of you who are accreditation liaison officers, if you're an ALO, you will thank me for saying this. It is not the ALO's responsibility to implement these recommendations. It is an institutional responsibility to implement recommendations. And that Just like the self-study is about the entire institution and Middle States is an institutional accreditor, not a programmatic accreditor. We accredit the whole institution. Therefore, everything, everybody, there are many different pieces of that report that touch more than one office, more than one unit, and many times is about the whole institution. So there should be an institutional level committee or some sort of group that can oversee, review, who can do that prioritization, prioritization I talked in number one, who's going to be doing that, of course, in consultation with your leaders, consultation with the president, and sometimes even consultation with the board. A very important piece is, as I said, it affects whatever the self-study report answer, the team report says, it normally would affect many different areas. So you should definitely determine who is accountable in each area and what benchmarks, what milestones you're going to shoot for. Without accountability, what you do is you risk having these recommendations fall by the wayside because the more pressing day-to-day issues just got in the way. So it has to be somebody responsible and somebody who's going to be held accountable for these. And last but not least, it would be important for you to identify what resources you need. And of course, that whoever authorizes the use, the allocation and use of those resources is involved in the process of prioritization, but also in the process of determining who is accountable for each of those issues. So it is important for you, depending on where you are in the process, but if you're the ALO, definitely help them keep this top of mind. Now, of course, as I said, you do not need to implement the suggestions or collegial advice. But if you have, particularly if you have recommendations, responses in conjunction with the annual institutional update, that will certainly keep it top of mind, at least one or two sections of the report over the next 4 years. But you don't need to have an AIU responses requirement, request in order to actually keep that on top of mind. And of course, if you have been asked to do a supplemental information report about a particular standard or two, then you need to get to work right away because you need to do a follow-up report, normally within 1 year, where you need to demonstrate how you're implementing those recommendations from the team. Those are the ones that are important here. And so for those of you who are in the audience, if by any chance you received over the last 6 months, or you will find out next week or this week if you received any follow-up reporting from last week's commission meeting, I strongly recommend that you attend our webinar on follow-up reports because that will give you a good idea of what it is that you're required to include in those follow-up reports. So that's it for me. We wanted this presentation to be more about your peers. And so we have chosen, as you have seen, we have chosen 3 very different institutions who are going to talk to us and tell us what they have done as a follow-up to the either the self-study or another major accreditation event. Kushnud, back to you.
Thank you. Now, before we do that, there's a very interesting question in the chat regarding the institutional priorities. So Christopher Malone's asking, can you speak a little bit about how these common themes after the self-study relate back to the institutional priorities of an institution during their self-study?
It is very common that when the institution has identified those priorities for self-study, that there are actual recommendations, self-recommendations that are derived from having addressed those institutional priorities. It is not very common because when the team comes, they are not assessing your priorities. They are assessing your compliance with the standards for accreditation, requirements, affiliation, policy procedures and federal regulations, it is not common for the institution, for the team to actually issue official recommendations for the priorities. However, if you have addressed the priorities very well in your self-study report, then you should have given yourself some very specific recommendations of where you want to go, how you want to improve. So if your priority was DEI, then you probably have recommendations that are related to your priority. So you would have basically two different kinds of recommendations. You would have recommendations related to your priorities, but also recommendations related to the compliance with the standard. And those are the more commonly coming from the team. Kush, do you have anything to add to that?
Only that really priorities are a great way to connect your self-study process to your strategic planning, because they are both in the forefront, and so they kind of automatically connect to each other, and that's a good thing, because that really is that kind of model is really geared towards continuous improvement, especially in the areas where you have your institutional priorities. And then also Christopher's asking if you can put it in writing. This is not ALO's responsibility.
Christopher, you will have a copy of the recording. You can clip the little piece of the recording and say, hey, the ALO's response.
And then another question is, can progress and self-recommendations be included in the AIU? And that, only if you're asked to do that in commission action, you can include those updates and progress made, or you should include those updates and progress made. Mm-hmm. And we'll address the rest of the questions a little later. So let's move on to my favorite part, which is the case studies from three different institutions, three very distinct institutions that have gone through this process last couple of years and now are implementing recommendations and suggestions to improve their operations, their academic as well as non-academic operations. So we'll start out with Thomas Jefferson University, and Dr. Raylan Cooter will share her insights on self-study process after there was a major merger that took place between Jefferson University and Philadelphia University, and how that was impacted by accreditation and what were some of the lessons learned. Raylan?
Thank you, Kushnid. And hello, everybody. I'm happy to be here this afternoon. I did smile when I heard Kushnid say that, you've gone through a 2.5-year process with Middle States, because if you look at these dates, and Kushnid knows exactly where I'm going, in December of 2015, the presidents of the two universities had talked enough to each other about a possible merger that they signed a letter of intent. And so we quickly made a call to Middle States so they didn't read about it in the paper the next day. And then starting with the new year of 2016, we were off and running, working with Middle States about our complex substantive change, and also thinking about what this integration was going to look like. Ironically, what is not listed on here is that our self-study was 2019-2020, but we were supposed to have our site visit the third week of March of 2020. We all know what was happening then. So then we got postponed until the fall of 2020 for a virtual visit. So our Middle States interaction was more like 4.5 years. The good thing about that is we never lost momentum. Our self-study theme was integration, and it was an easy one to choose. That's what we were focused on. We were integrating two completely different institutions. And when you integrate two completely institutions, there are large rocks, there are pebbles, and there are sand. You have to look at all of them. Our priorities were culture, technology, and infrastructure, policies and procedures, and governance and administration, because that seemed to, when we laid out the chart, encompass everything we were looking at. Next slide, please. So, an integration of two institutions is difficult anyway, or complex or cumbersome, but we were completely two different institutions. We were the original Thomas Jefferson University. was a primarily graduate health professions institution, while Philly U was a primarily traditional undergraduate institution. So we had to look at everything. We had, we were used to having older populations. We now had 17 and 18-year-olds. So right from the beginning, we had to look at our services to students, our policies for students, our policies for faculty. So we had to look at, everything from the cultural perspective to more nuts and bolts like our IT facilities. We started right from beginning a comprehensive policy review related to students, faculty, HR, research. We had to be clear that we were sure that our policies, our procedures, our culture was equitably transmitted to all of our students. We addressed this, or I should say our president addressed this by immediately figuring out that we needed an appointment of an enterprise-wide executive VP of diversity, inclusion, and community engagement. And just so I don't confuse anybody, when I refer to our enterprise, it's the university and the health system. Thomas Jefferson is a combination of an academic pillar and a clinical pillar. So much of what we do covers both. As time went on, we specifically have university and college committees on diversity and inclusion. We have a lot of educational programs about diversity, inclusion, community engagement, and our general mantra, our mission, our vision, because again, we want to make sure we tap into all of our students and all of our faculty. Again, we're crossing two cultures, so it hasn't always been easy. We developed as part of this, and I want to emphasize this for a moment because this has been a real boost to us continuing our quality improvement efforts after the self-study. We developed a brand new faculty shared governance structure with standing committees. And those have been, their first meetings were in fall of 2019, and they have been instrumental in helping us promote our Middle States self-study, our Middle States team report, our Middle States recommendations, what we decided to do on our own. These have been critical because we're talking to faculty directly and getting buy-in directly from the faculty, and they're helping carry this message to our students along with the administration carrying this message. Next slide, please. So again, I've already referenced, we were completely different institutions. And one of the major undertakings that we had to take on was integration. We had two completely student information systems. Which means if I'm a student on the Center City campus and I want to register for a course on the East Falls campus, I had to fill out a piece of paper and email it to somebody. So if I was crossed over between the two campuses, I couldn't check all my financial aid. Paying my bill was difficult. Figuring out if I took a course, getting into the learning management system was difficult. So we went to a single student information system and a single learning management system. That has really helped us feel more like a campus. We're not going to this system for one, this system for the other. We actually have the same platforms to address our educational programs and our student services. One of the things that we were focused on, and not surprisingly, Middle States was focused on, is how were we sure that policies and procedures were going to be consistent across campuses. The example I always used is if a student on the East Falls campus made a request and a student on the Center City campus made a request, we could not say, well, you can do that at East Falls, but you can't do that at Center City. So we had to do a deep dive into all of our policies and procedures, not just for students, not just for staff, faculty, and again, even research. We immediately launched into, before the complex substantive change was done, we immediately launched into looking at our governance and administrative structures. Those were key to this integration. But again, I'm going to circle back around to something I always said. While it was an interesting, I'll call it interesting, 4.5 years, we built up so much momentum that it really helped us and to continue this once we finished our team visit in the fall of 20. Culture, Center City campus never had a basketball team before. And now we do. You know, we have medical students on the Center City campus who, you know, maybe in their late 20s, early 30s, and they didn't really understand when we started putting out these new policies. We had to have a skateboard policy because nobody skateboards in Center City, but we have a policy out there. So it was a lot of dealing with cultural differences. We have made a lot of progress. And again, it's due to having shared governance committee, other standing committees, being on single platforms, the president, the board of trustees, and the provost carrying this message, a lot of communication coming out from the president's office and the provost office, a lot of sharing across academic programs, developing new programs, sharing of student services. But, you know, we've made a lot of progress. And as a matter of fact, if I can thank Middle States for a minute, they actually commented on the progress we've made, but there's more work to be done. We now have a basketball team, but not everybody cares as much about it as others. So, so if you ask me any questions, I can't answer just because I'm not a sports aficionado. But you know, the other thing is, you know, what an 18-year-old expects from a college experience, what a 28-year-old medical student expects from the college experience are always going to differ. So we're going to recognize there's going to be differences in culture, and it's not necessarily bad. There are differences in faculty expectation. This may sound silly, but one of the things we had to get used to on Center City is as we're developing committees, setting up projects, we had to recognize the fact that we had a significant cadre of faculty that were on 9-month contracts. That wasn't in existence before. So you can't say the committee is going to meet year round. You have to say September to May, or you're not acknowledging and respecting the other faculty members' place in this. Next slide, please. So one of the things I cannot stress enough has helped us at Thomas Jefferson University, that is now our name. We're a bigger campus, we have multi-campuses. But again, Middle States was not out here as a separate thing. Self-study was not out here as a separate item, because we were lucky in the fact that everything we were doing for the integration nicely fit into the standards. We had a checklist of, gee, we didn't think about this with the integration. Now look, it's part of the standard under 4 or under 5. Let's look at that too. And so we got in the habit of, again, using standing committees. I cannot emphasize that enough, because you don't want to have, my opinion, I found it easier not to have Middle States as a standalone thing, but to have it come up at other meetings. Then you get everybody to talk the talk. I'm happy to say that I have people, I sit on the faculty's committee of educational quality, and they've been talking about Middle States nonstop. So, you know, it's right there. It's not the other thing that poor Ray Lynn has to deal with. The other thing is, make sure you incorporate Middle States, whether it's your recommendations, their recommendations, collegial advice, whatever it is, into your short-term and long-term budget requests. I oversee 4 departments, and this year when we were doing our budget request, I said, look and see if anything we're requesting can either be tied to compliance issues or Middle States recommendations. That's kind of the norm when you're thinking about long-term strategic planning, but it may not necessarily be the norm when the registrar's office is asking for their annual budget. And to get that mindset going seems to help. So, and the other thing is, you know, we have university or college-wide strategic planning, then we have, you know, perhaps, you know, program strategic planning, but also incorporated in your administrative strategic planning. You know, if student services want to be in X position in 5 years, how is that validated by the industry standard and what Middle States has brought to the table for us? So thank you for letting me have this time to talk to you. And I want to thank Middle States for the fun ride we had for 4.5 years.
Thank you, Raylyn. And I know, because I've been with you on this ride for the last 5 years, how much work, how much hard work has gone into this. So thank you for sharing the insights. Next, Edna is going to speak with Mrs. Kelly Sisler from Garrett College.
Thank you, Kushner. Kelly and I have been working together for the last 5 years too. When Garrett College had a follow-up visit and then had a self-study visit. that now resulted in reaffirmation, but also resulted in some follow-up. So Kelly's going to talk to us about how Garrett College has leveraged the self-study work that was done into their new strategic planning processes. Kelly.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Corbett. And I want to thank MSCHE for the invitation to speak, and also Garrett College's president, Dr. Richard Midcap, who's very supportive on this endeavor. Can you go to the next slide, please? Just a little bit of background. Garrett College is the smallest community college, and we are located in Western Maryland. We are very rural, but we're different in the fact that we have dorms. So we have about a 25% population of students that come from Baltimore, DC, Pittsburgh, and the surrounding area. We also have a very large continuing education and workforce development program. We actually, as Dr. Corbett said, started to go through this process after a follow-up report we had in 2017. And here, going on what Dr. Cooter said, here's where I think there's a gap. A lot of people start the process 2 years before. And I recognize this because I came from industry, and I came in industry, those of you know, we constantly have value-added manufacturing teams, continuous improvement teams, but a lot of colleges and my counterparts I've spoke to treat it as middle stage, period. And it's 2 years before our self-study, let's get started. So we were in the process of our strategic planning for academic year 2019 and 2020 for our fiscal year 21-25 strategic plan. And it was happening at the same time as we were working on our self-study. In March of 2020, we were one of the last institutions to partake in an in-person self-study team visit. And we were asked to do a supplemental information report. Do not be afraid. They are really specific, and they're really just looking for you to support what you said in your report. They're looking for a little more, which we got through that. And in May, as I said, this was all going on at the same time, we were presenting our strategic plan to our Board of Trustees. June of 2020, the Board of Trustees accepted it. And then in July of 2020, we received our middle stage letter. I was ready to just jump and go. Let's start now. And Dr. Midcap nicely said, Kelly, please give everybody a break over the summer. So especially since COVID was happening, it was the right time. But my mind was spinning on how we can actually make this more continuous. Well, we had a new strategic plan. We knew the areas of opportunities and gaps and the collegial advice from our middle stage self-study. So what we decided to do was to work on a process that would help make our self-study write itself in 2028, not 2026. It's time to restart our self-study. Let's pick a team. Let's decide who's going to do what. And this also helped simplify our 2024 midpoint peer review process, which I think, Dr. Corbett, you wanted to make a comment that there was going to be a delay in some of the recent ones, or you might have already said that.
No, I was going to make a comment that if you're wondering what's happening with the MPPR, right now we are on a delay for the MPPR, and you will be receiving information soon about where we're going with that. Thank you.
But that doesn't include me. So I will still be on for 2024. So what we started to do is even though we physically really didn't come back to campus in fall of 2020, we began working on a continuous improvement effort. So if you could please go to the next slide, I will explain how. So what we did, in retrospect, I would have liked to do this the other way. We used our existing newly approved 2021-2025 strategic plan as our primer to map and align backwards to the middle state standards. In my opinion, though, what is a better guiding way is to use those standards to align to your strategic plan. because that way you can actually be able to use your self-study process to help drive your strategic planning so that it helps with that continuous improvement process. But we already had the existing strategic plan in place. So what we did is we utilized our existing strategic plan where we had 4 major goals with sub-objective and actions and strategies, but we assigned who our deans are. We have a dean in charge of goal 1, goal 2, goal 3, and goal 4, so that they can make people accountable. Because this was not all about me as the ALO driving this. This is about the institution as a whole. So we actually asked them to, champion their goal, and then we worked to align it back to a standard where it made the most sense at the time. And we had a couple extra standards where we assigned them accordingly. We then created a Microsoft Team folders for communication since we weren't physically on campus, and updating a living document, which you will see on the next slide, and I'll go over in a little more detail. But what we did was we created columns for the standard and the criteria, pertinent information that we got out of the 2020 self-study as far as follow-up and actions, and then helped align that to our current strategic plan. And we also took into account not everything's captured in your strategic plan. We do have other college plans and frameworks and initiatives going on at the same time, which we could also capture in that column. And then we are looking at doing, because we are so small, looking at handling specific initiatives that we're capable of at that time frame. The other thing I've learned from Dr. Corbett is people want to try to do too many things and everything at once. We realize that we can make better improvements if we focused on specific areas and utilized our resources to the best we could, being so small. And then what that will do is, if we're focused on that, we can either close it out or continue to another opportunity, or sometimes, as we know, working on something opens up another door. So that's how it becomes continuous. So then we focused on establishing cross-departmental working groups for the middle state standards, so that we're not 2026 looking at, oh, here's your standard, here's the team you're on. We're getting them involved right off the bat, because we feel that if you have a vested interest and you see how the middle state standards are helping to achieve the goals of your strategic plan, you're going to have better departmental crossover rather than working in silos. So therefore, we started using this past year, since everybody was back on campus for the 2021-2022 academic year, to focus on, our big focus was curriculum mapping, because as Dr. Corbett alluded to, with standards 5 specifically, improving assessment. And what we noticed, and this was alluded to earlier, we do not have sometimes meaningful measures. People are measuring things, but why are you measuring it? Not to check off a box, but rather you're measuring it so you can see where you either have an area of opportunity, you have a gap, where you're doing something well. Therefore, we want to see how this assessment then can drive the next academic year, and then what worked, what didn't work. So that's why we decided to go back to the drawing board and relook at our program mapping for curriculum, for our courses, and our gen ed competencies with respect to curriculum mapping, so that we could better align what tool was being assessed, whether it be an exam, a speech, a field study. So that's where the faculty is currently working right now, to map their programs, map their courses to each of the competencies, back to the mission, et cetera. So I know curriculum mapping is a total separate topic, and it's been discussed in a lot of different webinars. So with that, we'll move on to the next slide, and I'll show you a snippet of our table. So in our first column here, we have our standard. So what I did is I took each standard and then, so standard 1, you'll have in standard 2, the criteria. Standard 1 will be replicated several times, and then standard 2, because I wanted the criteria to match. And the reason why is we want this to be, in a way, somebody to be able to filter it or sort it. So if somebody just wants to focus specifically on standard 1, they can just drop, the filter to standard 1. If they just want to look at a specific criteria, they can filter down to that. Then what we did is took the pertinent information from our self-study and put certain things that we were working on or continue to work on, or what was identified from collegial advice in the self-study, or as far as recommendations. And those were what we felt were things we needed to work on. And so then we put some follow-up actions into place. And then what we did was we aligned it to what we're currently working on in the strategic plan, so that we can better create that marriage between the two. So we just didn't have strategic planning and just didn't have middle states. We had that continuity. And then from what there, I only put a couple of columns. These were a couple specific actions for spring of 2022. So for example, for criteria 1.1b, we have our Dean of Academic Affairs and Dean of Continuing Education working with specific major employers in the area to look at areas of need and opportunity, which then is helping to achieve our goal of our strategic plan, which is objective 3.1.2. Then the last column, this is not just the ALO. Everybody's responsible. Therefore, if Dr. Midcap wants to say, oh, how is it going with strategic plan, this objective or this goal, he can drop down and look who the person responsible is, look at the spreadsheet because it's in Teams, and say, oh, here's the update. Okay, this is good. It makes people accountable. It makes it a living document, and it'll help us to be seamless in continually working on improvements. But what we hope to do is when our next strategic plan comes out, we will be able to better use the middle states criteria as our primer to drive our strategic plan. So that's just the approach that we're currently taking. We're small. We have a handful of people that are doing multiple roles. So we did choose the approach of picking the best 5 or 6 priorities that we can work on and do it well. So next slide. I think that's it for me.
I think this is it. Thank you very much, Kelly. I think I would love for you to repeat when you say, why are you measuring that? That is that key question for the last criterion for standard 5.
Well,
are you assessing the assessment?
One of the key things we use is during the self-study, we have assessment, but during COVID, people wanted to drop assessment. And I explained that people were still having discussions on Teams or Zoom. People, there were still a couple field assignments that were happening. So I used the example of more qualitative measures. If you are specifically asking a question on a discussion, you can do assessment and you can gauge their critical thinking. You can understand things by these discussions. So assessment, everybody just wanted to drop it, but it could still happen. And those measures, as far as qualitative feedback, are very meaningful.
Yes, and during COVID and during pivoting to all online to an area that maybe you might not have been familiar with, it's even more different, more important.
Right.
It may be difficult, but it's even more important to demonstrate quality, the quality of what you're offering. So thank you, Kelly. We have gone from a very large, complex institution to a small community college, and now we're moving on to a special kind, special focus type of institution.
So thank you, Edna. Before we go to Jose, I just want to reemphasize something that Kelly mentioned, and that is that you do need a break after self-study, just to kind of recharge, reflect on what happened, celebrate your successes, but then it's time to get back to work. So yes, you do need a little break to kind of decompress. And now we'll move forward with Juilliard College, and Dr. Jose Garcia Leon is going to talk about assessment and its relationship with the self-study process and the post-self-study process. Jose?
Thank you. Good afternoon to everyone. It's very nice to be here. I wish I could see you, but at least we are in touch through Zoom. Thank you to Dr. Corbett and Dr. Hack for the invitation to Middle States. The Juilliard School is a rather small institution. It's the Conservatory for the Performing Arts with degrees in dance, in drama, and music. In drama, it includes acting and playwriting, and music covers the typical things that you would expect in classical music, but also jazz. We have a special program on historical performance related to Baroque music. And we're located in New York. To be honest, I was surprised to be invited to this panel, especially when compared to the incredible success of my colleagues here. I feel that we still have much left to do. That said, looking back, it's true that the journey has taken us a long way. So I'm sure much of what I could tell you, you already know, or maybe you've already done. But anyway, happy to share our story in case it could be helpful. And I welcome any questions you may have. If we run out of time and you have questions or they come up later, feel free to reach out directly to me, or you can do it through Middle States. I have a few points. I only have a couple of slides, but key elements that I thought would be worth mentioning, at least from our side of the story. One key outcome that we were expecting from the self-study process was to ignite development or enhance a culture of assessment. Assessment was already taking place in many cases virtually daily, as it happens in a conservatory. But for us, it was a matter of finding effective ways to document it, analyze it, use it in a specific ways for planning. And as an additional benefit, to also make the process more transparent, less dependable on individuals, which can happen in small institutions like Juilliard. We always joked about the should I be hit by a bus syndrome. Departments that rely on one individual to be the institutional memory or the repository of assessment, and thinking, should that individual have to go, then there would be a huge loss. So part of the goal for us was to increase transparency, but also share knowledge across different individuals within an area so that they could cover for each other if it happened to be necessary. So one of our goals, in addition to developing that culture of assessment, was also to improve transparency and shared knowledge. And acknowledging that also some of our programs are very unique or very specific in what they do, even though the title might not be immediately clear in that way. So some keys to success as we identify them. One was to really focus on the opportunities of innovation and improvement. That's something that we took very seriously during the process of the self-study writing itself. We actually asked each working group in the self-study to develop as many OIIs as they could come up with, a kind of a wish list driven by aspirational goals. That was probably a little bit dangerous, but we thought it was necessary. A particular group that shall remain unnamed came out with something more about, 40 plus bullets of opportunities for improvement. And that was fine. We were actually okay with that. On one hand, we didn't want to miss out anything that came up in the discussions of each of the groups. But also, we realized that by looking at such long lists in each area, we could identify trends that seemed important and that were not as clear in general surveys. Eventually, these ideas, obviously, they were boiled down to 3, 4 per standard. But some of those that were the final choices were informed by a large set of ideas. And many of those eventually have made their way now to a new strategic plan. So our intention was to not let them go, but find different ways to use them in the future of the institution. I understand that all of you here have already gone through the visit, so I'm assuming you already have your OIIs set. But you can also use your own strategic plans with the same idea, or might be an opportunity to revisit some of those opportunities. But the point is that they can guide many important conversations, and rather than being an isolated exercise or just a check on a box, they can literally become opportunities and provide maybe the foundation for budgetary requests, affect the direction of the institution. It can really help. We're very fortunate in that the leadership was in full support from the beginning on this process of assessing the assessment or improving assessment. That might not be true everywhere. They were on board, and we invited them and included them in every discussion. And when we were releasing some of the information to the community, I'm assuming for those of you who might have some pushback, I don't know that I have lots of words of wisdom on that, but I think it's important to maybe have individual meetings, small group discussions, using data from your own institution or even from others as examples. If it all fails, there's always the card of, but Middle States recommends this, or it was mentioned on the report, and it should be something that they have access to and are familiar with. We did not need to pull that card, but in my opinion, there's nothing wrong with reminding anyone who pushes back that what the accreditation requirements are or what best practices are. One approach that we took early on and very seriously was the idea of teamwork at every step. We tried a very careful balance of representation and inclusion in the assessment committee itself. Also, a very thoughtful consideration of a manageable size, even if that meant that maybe not every single area will be directly represented, but finding ways that they could be by either a liaison or some other member. We felt that having too large a group would make it too unwieldy or difficult to manage on a regular basis. And also thinking of skill sets, having good writers, good thinkers, good individuals with strong communication skills, things that would, as a team, complement each other. And that has worked really well. Also in the sense of seniority and experience, we were very keen to have several members who were very much junior members of the staff or the faculty. And I find that that was a very effective move in that they not only had fresh ideas, but also it was an opportunity for them to grow into the process and show the potential they have, feel included in the institution. They've been extremely helpful. Also, as they sometimes have voiced their own experience working with the group, being new to then other areas where maybe for them it was the first time that were approached in this way from us. Maybe we can go to the next and final slide from me. Our main project this year, and the one that maybe I can talk to you in more detail, has been updating and developing program goals for all the degrees at Juilliard. The first step that we took was to have very large community presentations with the leadership guiding the conversations, showing their support. These presentations were made, I hope, with a very general positive attitude. And I see, but I hope it's true that it's not that I'm blind, that it has seeped through each working group. That sense of this is an opportunity to get better, not necessarily a chore that we just have to go through. The focus has been definitely on the positive side of assessment, meaning identifying weaknesses in order to address them, or not being afraid of celebrating success, things that are done well. Often when working on assessment, there is a temptation to focus only on what's wrong or even being afraid of what might come out of that process. But it's also helpful to identify what's going well, what could be continued, even things that have gone well in the face of the challenges that we've had in the last few years. But it's also important not to be afraid to identify failure or things that came short or gaps. It could be an opportunity to ask for more resources, reconsider curriculum, the current setup, or even the level of student or faculty support. But the approach has been that when working with each department, as it is happening right now, where they're editing, updating their goals, a priority for us has been to make it their own voice, to make sure they don't feel we're imposing any goals on them. Of course, there are guidelines, there are goals that we wouldn't particularly accept. We always have, as very wisely Kelly Sisler said, we always have the question on whether whatever they're talking about is measurable, what the assessment method will be. And it's interesting when we hear goals and the question is, what's gonna be the method to assess it? Immediately the goal gets shifted or tweaked in ways that make it actually much more meaningful. So having that right away is very important, but we've tried very hard to not impose or feel that each department, as they edit or develop their own goals, that they feel they have their own voice, they can control the journal narrative. And we've tried to adapt to each of the departments, their own strengths or ways of working. For instance, departments that are more dispersed. Maybe we met with a subset of the faculty that then would be the communicators with the rest. With other departments where they tend to do everything together, we just had a meeting of the entire department, including part-time faculty, and just get their input. We've also had different approaches depending on their working style. There were a few that really wanted to control the language, and that was fine. So we let them work on drafts on their own. And now we're providing feedback and having that kind of conversation. In others, where maybe they were smaller or maybe too afraid to do things on their own, we did kind of the interview approach that I call, where we would ask what their goals, aspirations are, and then we would draft a few ideas that they could work on. So we were not telling them what to do, but we were facilitating the process and giving them examples from our own or from other departments or from even outside institutions. So the main message though, in every one of these meetings, the large, the small, has always been, this is not an empty exercise. It's not just to check a box. It's one that can be extremely beneficial for the health of the department, of the institution. It's a real opportunity for improvement. And also it's a chance to voice clearly what the department is about, which sometimes might not be very immediately clear to the outside. A couple of concerns that we heard in conversations, there were a couple of areas that were afraid that all of this would be too much work. And we clarify right away, this is the plan for the next 3-4 years. So this is what we're gonna do now, this is what we do next year. Because as soon as they heard about program review, they were in panic thinking, we don't have time for this. Well, there is time to do it. It's not gonna happen this month. Now, this is what we need to do, and we're gonna help you along the way. And then we'll work on this for next year. So we gave them kind of a syllabus of a multi-year process so that it would ease any fear that suddenly they had a truckload of things to do. And the other thing, we sensed in a couple of departments that they were very eager to work, but were very afraid to do it wrong. And for those, we provided rubrics, samples. We hope to ease their fear and also be very mindful that in feedback that we provided, that it was helpful and not trying to make them feel like they had missed the mark. The last thing I would say, in order to enhance this transparency that we've been having as a priority, we intend to share all drafts with every department as soon as they're ready. They don't have to be the final version. In fact, we're gonna share them as soon as the departments feel comfortable sharing. And we have an actual SharePoint site that all drafts are already being collected so that everyone can see each other's work. partly because there are some common trends that would be helpful for them to see, also to realize that they're not on their own. But I mean, frankly, nothing wrong with learning from your past, right? There are ideas that maybe they didn't think about that suddenly, oh, wait, they came up with this and that works for us too. And we're all on the same team. So nothing wrong with sharing resources that way. We plan also to have some larger meetings, but not everyone can attend them. So we're hoping that we'll have that SharePoint as a great resource. And already, even though it's only in the early stages, we've seen many, many hits. So it looks like they're very actively looking at what others are working on. The only thing I would say to close is that even in departments where they were skeptical that they could do what they needed to do, a commonality across the board, we're not in education for the money, right? Or at least not most of us. We're here because we love teaching. And it's interesting that as soon as you mention students in any group, suddenly the conversation shifts. So a constant reminder that we've had in meetings, especially if they were getting to a point where it seemed to be a difficult resolution or not a clear one, was, well, what's this about? In what ways can this help a student? What do you want to achieve when you have this particular requirement? Or why are you looking at this as something that needs to be assessed? How will that be meaningful to the student? And it's interesting that every time that comes up, it completely shifts the point of view. And rather than be an exercise, it becomes more of a mission or a very important goal. I think there are a few questions. I wonder, should we go through them now, or is that something that we want to do later?
I think we can wait towards the end. But thank you, Jose, for sharing your experience, and thanks to Kelly and Raylene for sharing their wisdom and experience. This is really great for our institutions who are going through this process now. Edna, back to you.
Thank you, Dr. Hack. And thank you very much, Jose. We did ask you because we know that assessment is a big piece of how people run. And if I had, if I were a lottery buyer, I would say I would put my money. That's where a lot of the self-study outcomes are going in terms of improving assessment processes. So thank you for sharing that. And we will get to the questions about Juilliard in a bit. So this is more of a summary. You probably have heard some of these things already on what our colleagues have been sharing. But we thought that it was important to add a couple of slides in terms of documenting ongoing compliance. Because as Kelly says, you don't have to wait. You should not wait 2 years prior to the visit. Say, okay, let's now identify what documentation we have for what we've been doing. But instead, that practice of documenting that ongoing compliance is going to make things way more easier the next time that you have to do self-study. Plus, documenting that ongoing compliance allows you to also share on those successes and say, yes, we're doing great, but also finding the gaps early enough so those gaps are not being filled or addressed just because of self-study, but because it's something that will benefit the institution. So what are some of the things we have seen our institutions are doing? One is that development of longer term assessment and institutional effectiveness plans. Jose, just talked about that, having, several years in advance. So people know that we don't want you to do that right now. This is something that is going to take several years to complete, but actually have that assessment plan in place. The important thing is also to use the reports that are already being generated, reports that are generated by departments, by the deans, by department chairs, by unit directors, to evidence the use of process and qualitative evaluation methods, to show how you are doing systematic assessment and having those reports that directors, deans, chairs, or leaders are being evaluated on, you're using those reports to document what you're doing, showing that you're using rubrics to evaluate the quality of assessment processes, or as we did today, we can do case study approaches. I actually like the case study approaches because it helps at the time of writing the self-study report. As things really good happen, document, tell the story, write the story, and that is going to then make it easier for you at the time of writing the self-study report. What examples are we going to use to show that this is something that has been going on? So it's not only last year we did this, but 3-4 years ago we did this, and this is how we did it. So document good things that are happening, and that's going to help you. Why not wait until you're getting ready for Self-Study Institute? Use evidence within annual report, and make sure that annual reports then and periodic unit reports are connected to the standards. That is not a requirement, but as you have seen from Kelly, for them, it will be a lot easier for them to document compliance because their plan already is pegged to the standards and the criteria. And also, you do not duplicate the efforts. You're doing both, documenting ongoing compliance for accreditation, but also you're documenting the progress on your strategic plan. An example that I often, I like to say, but because people always ask, how are we going to document that the board members are using assessment information? And one thing that I often recommend is, why don't you use annotated agendas that complement the minutes from the board? Because if you only have the minutes, it doesn't have the story behind of what did they use in order to make that decision. Minutes are usually very terse, but have an annotated agenda and have that going along. And you can then see from last year, this is what we do, how are we doing it this year, and then plan for the following year. Other good practices for documentation is your reports. And I think we have heard from all three of our institutions. Your reports those ongoing reports should demonstrate your understanding of the importance of unit assessment and the connection to budgeting and planning. So as Dr. Kuder said, Braylin said, yeah, you say, well, it was in middle states. It was in the report. It is a good rationale for that budget request. So that connection between assessment and budgeting and planning, and if you continue to document that as part of your budget request, for example, that can be used also as evidence. You should be identifying key performance indicators for your strategic goals. And so have your reports include the metrics for assessing those KPIs. And then those reports, whether the unit reports, department reports, document where you are. What is it that you're measuring? And so you need to have that interplay between what you're measuring, why you're measuring, your templates and your rubrics, to the annual periodic reviews. Connect them to the surveys that you're conducting. Maybe you're conducting the NESI or one of those other student surveys, and definitely connecting to the key performance indicators. How what you're doing in the classroom, what you're doing in assessment is having an impact on the key performance indicators for student performance, for student achievements such as retention, graduation, and so on. And so this one may sound a little pedestrian, but it really helps when you employ infographics, charts, tables. It is an easy use, a picture tells, is better than 1,000 words. I think that's the expression. But really from the very beginning, because it is a way not only to remember, to document things for the self-study, but it also helps other people understand, particularly when you have new people come on board that you're going to now, they're going to be responsible for continuing some of that work. And as you heard from Jose, they have a SharePoint site that they're already, they just had their self-study a year and a half ago, self-study visit, but they're working on the next time and documenting what you're doing with that SharePoint site. So those are just, our general recommendations for documentation. And I'm going to take it back then to our wonderful co-facilitators. And we have some questions, and Krishnud, it's all yours now.
Great, thank you. And for the sake of time, I want to use this time as much as possible so we can speak to our co-facilitators. One of the questions was, please confirm for any recommendations made to ourselves in the self-study, are you saying that 8 years from now, a visiting team could look at how an institution addresses these? I can answer that actually, and that is, you're not required to do that, but it's good practice for continuity and to gauge your own progress. So yes, you don't have to address them directly, but it would be very good practice to do that. Other questions, let's see. Oh, how much consideration, I guess this is for more middle states than the co-facilitators, how much consideration will be given to progress on recommendations and improvements that were impeded by halted by COVID? In other words, how would you consider that?
During the first year of the pandemic, we actually asked institutions to write an addendum on how things, how the pandemic had affected. But after that, from that, this year on forward, what we expect is that you integrate into your regular self-study how the pandemic and all those other situations have impacted the recommendations. So if you have a good story and if you have a good report, and it's not something that is written in the self-study report, but it's documented from this point now. It's documented in your program reports or department reports. This is what we propose, but these are the circumstances. And it's not only the pandemic, there may be other things. Our colleagues in Puerto Rico had 2 major hurricanes, and they had, so they're, our colleagues down in Florida sometimes are dealing with hurricanes and that. So things happen. The thing is, document what happened and document then how are you going to address it and what are you going to do moving forward.
Thank you, Edna. And I see Raylan's already connecting with people in the chat, so that's wonderful to see. And there's a question for Jose. Do you have any, let's see, which one? Oh yeah. Do you have any institutional learning outcomes? When you worked on the PLOs, did you align them with ILOs?
That's a great question. We don't have learning outcomes per se, but we do have a mission statement with very clear goals, and they're in the website. That's being step 1 with working with the departments. I should have mentioned that. We reviewed them together and told them this is what we have, and this is going to be the founding instrument. And then from there, we're going to develop your own goals or enhance the ones that you have, but they need to be acknowledging and fed from the motherboard. We actually made a chart from Juilliard and the divisions that we call like music, dance, drama, then each of the departments. And then within that, we had little umbrellas. And so we have like a chart for each department with how those bubbles connect. And we hope to develop a site with all the goals for each area where by clicking on the links, you get that same tree.
Thank you, Jose. And there's a follow-up question for you, actually. Did you use a template for the program review or a handbook? If so, can you share it?
We will. We're working on that. We have a very developed draft that is not final yet. What we do have is a guideline, we think there are guidelines on how to develop program goals, and that we can share if anyone is interested. But just let me know.
Thank you. And there are a few people who would like to reach out to you, both you and Kelly. So if you can just put your, I think you already have, but in case you haven't, just put your contact email in the chat, please. Let's see if we have any other.
I would like to ask Lori Hefner, what do you mean by we use to win the lottery syndrome? Maybe
Right.
you could put something.
That
in
might
the
be
chat.
in relation to what I said of hit by the bus.
Oh,
If you win the lottery,
Okay.
you're out of here, right?
as opposed to hit by the bus. Okay, thank you.
I'm gonna use Lori's from now on. It's much more poetic than hit by the bus.
That's right. So can we have 1 minute from each of you? Just one final thought, takeaway, one major takeaway from that you can share with our colleagues. 1 minute. So we're gonna go Raylin.
So I'm probably going to take less than 1 minute because I'm just going to repeat something I already said, and that is Middle States should not be this standalone entity. Middle States should be the thing that guides everything we do, our budget processing, our department strategic plans, our review of policies, our trying to improve things for faculty and students. It's not that we're trying to do this and, oh yeah, at some point we're going to have to tell Middle States about it. It's like, we're trying to do this. How do the Middle State standards fit into this?
Wonderful, thank you. Kelly?
Well, since Raylan just mentioned that and Jose mentioned this, not about checking off the box, I will support what Dr. Corbett had said. By aligning our strategic plan to the Middle States, it's also helping to reinforce and support budgetary requests.
Thank you, and Jose?
I'm sorry, I can't stop repeating some of what's already been said because there's such great comments. I love what Dr. Cooter said about that Middle States is ongoing and it's not just once every 8 years. One thing that I often say about Middle States is that it's not a dark entity out somewhere else in outer space, that there are real people, there are peers, and I do tell them it's us, we are Middle States.
Yeah.
So it's important to remember that it's a group of individuals on the same, facing the same challenges and trying to move forward together. It's not a dark entity somewhere else.
Thank you, Jose, and thank you all three of you for really great insight and great conversation. And I'm pretty sure that the next cohort will very much benefit from that. Any parting words, Edna, from you?
Oh, my last party words is, it is not about measuring, it's not about only compliance, it's about what is best for the institution. How can we always improve? It's about continuous improvement because we need to keep our sight on the main goal. And I think Jose said it well, it's about the students. It's about what the students need and how we're going to serve them with a quality education. So thank you everyone for attending with us today. We appreciate being with us. And a big, big thank you, Kelly, Jose, Raylin. We couldn't do it without you. Thanks.
Thank you.
And thank you for our support, Brian Kirshner and Steve Pugliese, who have been here for support for us on the technical side for today. You will receive a survey for ask you for feedback on the webinar. And in the survey, we will include a link to the video. And we have already shared in the chat a link to the actual PowerPoint presentation, to a PDF of the presentation. And we welcome your feedback. We're always looking for ways to improve.
Thank you all.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.